Good afternoon, welcome. I have known a lot of people in the academic, political, and business worlds who have a very well established Wednesday morning ritual. Each picks his or her copy of the Financial Times and go straight ahead to read Martin Wolf's column. This habit is understandable. Those of us who, for professional reasons, are in need of following the evolution of the economy and the geopolitics of the world know well that reading Martin's articles is a habit that is practically indispensable. It's indispensable and also very enjoyable. Martin has a unique capacity to describe, analyze, and debate complex economic phenomena and ideas. And he does this with outstanding clarity and lucidity, despite being an economist. For as we all know, we economists do a very poor job in communicating our propositions, our ideas to other professions and to the public at large. Fortunately, we have Martin, and unfortunately, we have only a few others as proof of the exception to the rule. Martin has been fulfilling this role of explaining economics to the public at large and also to our own profession consistently since he joined the Financial Times, I think 17 years ago. And let me tell you that he has done it again this year in a masterful way with the publication of his book on why globalization works. In my opinion, Martin's new book is the most accessible, coherent, comprehensive, and lucid work that has been published on this subject, at least until now. I am particularly thankful to Martin, not only because his book deals with a number of the issues that we pursue at the Center for the Study of Globalization, but also because the publication of his book came just in time to be assigned as required reading for the course that T.N. Risnavasan and myself are now teaching, Economics 300. And I am taking careful note of the students that are attending the lecture, but I will take more careful note of those that are not attending the lecture, and they will pay the consequence. So it's great to have such an excellent book available, but I think it's even better to have its author with us now. So please, let's welcome very warmly Martin Wolf.
Oh dear. First of all, it's a tremendous honor to be here in this great university. As a journalist, I'm not sure that I would even claim anymore to be an economist, and I think many economists would doubt whether I ever was one. I lack many of the qualities required to be an economist. One of them is I am capable of the completely impenetrable prose, and secondly, I am incapable of the even more impenetrable algebra. So I had to fall back on journalism instead, and because in the last resort it was the best I could do with with such talents as I had. In an earlier stage of my life, I was a bureaucrat at the World Bank. Indeed, that's where I met T.N., and I have to say I was even less suited for that than I was suited for being a professional academic economist. So I ended up probably, since I believe in comparative advantage, where I had to be. Being in Yale, nonetheless, is a bit daunting, particularly in front of this audience, which contains so many immensely distinguished scholars. One of the reasons, I think, that very few people would have dared to write this book is that it requires inordinate self-confidence or ignorance to attempt to write a single work which covers such a vast theme as this one. Because what I have tried to do is essentially to treat the economics of globalization in its broadest possible respect, as in all its many aspects. I cannot, therefore, obviously, in the 25 or 30 minutes I'm going to speak, begin to cover all that is contained in the book, and I'm not going to attempt to do so. What I would like to do is introduce what I think of as some of the major themes of the book. I'll say a little bit about how it's structured, and then the major themes of the book. And then I hope that will allow us to get into a question and answer session, which I usually find most enjoyable, informative for me, and probably most amusing for the audience, because it's like pricking a bull. So let me just say, first of all, how the book is structured, what I've tried to do. What I tried to do, first of all, is to lay out the arguments for globalization as in terms of the market economy as a whole. To me, globalization, I'll come to this in a moment, is simply the extension of the market across frontiers, and one has to start by understanding why any economist would believe, or indeed anyone would believe, a market economy is a good idea. And it's pretty clear from the literature, if you read the literature on globalization, which is very vast and not always very distinguished in its intellectual qualities, that many people doubt that there's any really good reason for having market economies at all. So I wanted to lay those arguments out, and also to relate them to the politics of our societies, the connection between the market economy and liberal democracy, which I think is close and intimate. The second thing I wished to do was to describe the history of globalization. Many people seem to think that international economic integration, or international integration more broadly, is something that was invented by Reagan and Thatcher and a few other lunatics in about 1980, and nothing like this ever happened before. And I wish to make it clear that things like this had happened before. Indeed, it's part of a very, very long process. I go back only a few thousand years, but some people I've since discovered would say that it all started when the first human beings left Africa about 70 to 100,000 years ago. So I don't go that far back. And I do in particular discuss at some length what is sometimes called the first modern globalization, namely the period of 1870 or so to 1914, which came to a rather disastrous end, and I will come to that in this talk. Then I have a very, very long section in which I try as best I can to go through pretty well all the arguments I could find relating to the economics of globalization, and I tried to distinguish the ones that seem to me to make sense, and some of them do, from the ones that don't. And then finally, I assess the likelihood that globalization will last, that this process of liberalization will last, and if it does last, what we can do about it. So that's really what the book tries to do, and I think it's because it is rather perhaps inordinately ambitious that it also got inordinately long. When I signed with the Yale University Press, I promised to deliver a text not more than 100,000 words long. What they got was 130,000 words and 25 to 30,000 words of footnotes and references, and thank God I was publishing with an academic press, is all I can say. Right, so that's what the book is about. Now, for some strange reason that I don't understand, my screen is blank, and I'm not sufficiently much of a genius to work out what to do about it, so I'm going to have to look at the board. What I'd like to cover very briefly is just 5 aspects of this. First, markets. I said I'm going to talk a little bit about markets, and then I'm going to talk about states, because there is a very powerful and important aspect of this book, to me at least, in that I emphasize the relationships, mutually supportive relationships between the two. Then I'm going to touch very briefly on the argument, and these are going to be touched upon quite briefly, that in some obvious respects, and I won't go into it in great detail, compared with if you compare the present period with the late 19th century, early 20th century period, we're not living in a... What is striking in many ways is how little globalization there is, or in other words, how little integration there is, how fragmented the world economy is in fundamental respects. Then I'm going to have a rather longer section which looks at one key aspect, one of the most controversial aspects, namely growth, inequality and poverty. I think many people are particularly interested in that. And then finally I'd like to look at the question of threats to globalization, in particular whether we are likely to experience another period similar to that of the first half of the 20th century when the integrated world economy basically collapsed. So those are the points that I'd like to touch upon in this lecture. First of all, markets. Let me start, as I said, to spell out what I think of as globalization for the purposes of this book. If you study the literature on this subject, which I said is vast, a great deal of it is written by sociologists. I have nothing against sociologists. Some of my best friends, including my wife, is a sociologist. So, but there's a vast literature from sociologists, and a large number of people write about it from the point of view of cultural studies, and they emphasize the cultural implications and the broader societal implications of the process of integration. But my book is about economics. It starts from economics, and I essentially define globalization as a process of integration of economies through markets across frontiers. There are, in essence, if you think about what drives a globalization process in that sense, there are two underlying forces. The first is technology, essentially the costs of transport and communications, and the second is policies of liberalization, namely the liberalization of barriers at the border. Now, one of the obvious features of the, not only of the last 2 centuries, but in fact of millennia, has been the progressive reduction in the costs of transports and communications. This is one of the things that human beings have been rather good at, but the process of reduction of costs of transport and communications accelerated in the course of the 19th century and, of course, through the 20th century. But I make the point at some length, and I'm happy to discuss it further, that on by some substantial measures, though we can never be quite sure, the process of technological transformation as it related to transport and communications was more rapid and fundamental in the 19th century than in the 20th century. The reason I emphasize that is, again, to try and emphasize that this is not a really new phenomenon. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the invention of the steam train, the steam ship, and the cable, the international cable, completely revolutionized the ability to transport goods and to transport information, and really for the first time made possible something like an integrated world economy. And in very important ways, it was very highly integrated by the beginning of the 20th century. Technology, of course, continued throughout the 20th centuries. We had, in particular, the invention of civil aviation, and the most fundamental change, unquestionably, was the speed with which the primitive cable technology of the 19th century turned into telephony and everything all the way down to the contemporary internet. So we moved to a world which, particularly in the last 30, 40 years, the principal change in costs has been cost of communication. Costs of transport, interestingly, seem to have fallen very little, if at all, in the last 20 to 30 years. So it's really been the costs of communication. These changes have been linear and consecutive and consistent, but interestingly, as I remark in the book, the trade, capital flows and so forth have not followed the same path at all. In fact, after a period of very high integration with very high trade ratios, very high ratios in terms of capital flows, lots of statistics suggest a high level of capital market integration, this all went into reverse between 1914 and 1945 before the liberalization process restarted. And the important point about that, the absolutely crucial point, is that the globalization process was and remains a policy choice. That is to say, governments made a series of choices which restarted the liberalization process and restarted the integration process. This began in the post-war period predominantly in the transatlantic world, with some countries in East Asia joining in, and then in the last 20 or 30 years, as most people know, an increasing number of developing countries and former communist countries also transformed their economies. And in all these cases, and I think it's extremely important to emphasize that, and that is why I start off with the discussion of the market, what these countries did was more or less simultaneously, with the relationships often being complicated and difficult, but they more or less simultaneously liberalized markets internally and externally. This was a market revolution more broadly, in which countries like China or India or Russia or Brazil, and the list is very, very long, all made a number of steps towards greater steps towards the market economy at home and integration abroad. And I argue that while it has been quite customary for international economists to argue that in some sense the case for the market at home, the case for laissez-faire at home, is rather different from the case for free trade. In practice, the processes both in the late 19th and early 20th century and more recently have been very similar, or above all, essentially contemporaneous. That's what happened in the 1980s and 90s, and the globalization process, which created all the protests, followed from that. So essentially, while there was this long ongoing transformation of technological opportunities, and particularly the costs of communication collapsing in the last 30, 40 years, we had a huge liberalization, restriction, and then liberalization wave over the last 150 years. And we happen to have lived at the end, or we happen to be now, and I don't know whether it's at the end, but in a period of pretty close to global liberalization. And of course, it's no particular surprise why that happened. It happened because the planned economy, inward-looking alternatives seemed to the policymakers in the countries concerned by the late 1970s, early 1980s, to have proved essentially a dead end, and they all decided to a greater or less extent at the same time to transform their policies, and globalization followed. Now, the second theme of the book is the role of states. This theme runs through the whole book. And a lot of it, I suppose, by now is taken for granted among economists, but I think it's fair to say that there was a lengthy period when people who were interested in markets tended to the view that in some sense governance and states didn't matter very much, possibly because many of them lived in countries like yours or mine and more or less took for granted the existence of a reasonably competent state with a reasonably competent judicial system in which the Prime Minister or President did not steal everything that moved, and as it turned out, anyone who worked on development, as I did in the 1970s, discovered, rather to their surprise in my case, perhaps less so to my Indian colleagues and other colleagues, that these assumptions were not in fact very realistic, that there were a very large number of states, societies, where you could not assume a supportive state. So the book emphasizes that markets need strong and supportive states. In fact, they need something rather special. A market economy, which is going to be a tolerable liberal democracy, they need something rather special. And when you think about it, it is so special that it's rather surprising that it ever exists. And that is, you need a state, in fact, I'm just writing a column about this for Wednesday, which is very strong. That is to say, it truly has a monopoly of coercive force, that you can be reasonably confident when you go out about your business the only institution likely to take all your money away from you is, in fact, the police force and the courts, not your neighbour or neighbours. But at the same time, you have to be confident that this very powerful state is constrained, that it will say it will be law governed and act in accordance with the rules and principles of its own legal and constitutional order. And as I point out, this is not, to put it mildly, a novel thought, since it's been had by many far greater people, including particularly Thomas Hobbes. It's not quite obvious why such a state should ever exist. Why should there ever have emerged states which, as it were, have the capacity to take everything that moves and yet, or is not, even doesn't move, and yet forbears to do so? And the answer I give at some length is that there seems to have been in a number of societies, but I think quite particularly in the West in the last 200-300 years, and of course in a number of Western offshoots like the United States, the emergence of such a state as a result of a range of factors coming together, among them the competition among states for resources. They weren't truly monopolies, because people could leave and resources could leave if they started governing badly enough. Constitutional reforms which really did shift power towards assemblies, and quite profound institutional reforms, the creation of genuinely independent and genuinely honest bureaucratic elites. This is pretty well a universal process which has achieved these things in a number of Western states. Unfortunately, as we've discovered in the last 40-50 years, such states are rare. Far more common are predatory states or weak states, those that lack, in fact, an effective monopoly of force. I think it's not very difficult to think of countries to the south of the United States in which essentially the government lacks a monopoly of force. Think of Colombia, for example. And of course, there are now a very large number of failing states which are essentially dysfunctional, where you have something close to anarchy. As I've argued, good states seem to be created by a complicated historical process, and I've listed some of the factors. But the main point I make is, if you wanted to understand why it is that there has been such an extraordinary divergence in wealth across the world, I argue that the most important single cause is, and of course it's a vicious circle, I'm not suggesting this is where it all starts, is a sort of dreadful spiral into which the whole range of countries have fallen, in which very bad states lead to essentially the collapse of basic state services and the ability to raise revenue. This obviously means that people have to look after themselves, and the last thing they will ever do is provide taxes to the state, so the state gets even worse, and you basically end up in something like a Hobbesian universe. And it seems to me that that is a description, alas, of fairly large proportions of today's world, and above all, that part of today's world in which globalization is definitively not working. I end the book by arguing that this is our greatest challenge, and I end it very carefully by saying it's our greatest challenge, because I don't know what the solution is. But it does seem to me that's the problem. And so that's the second big theme. The third big theme of the book is that if you look at what has happened into our world economy, and here we can have some interesting debates about how far you think globalization could go. And if you compare where we are today with the late 19th and early 20th century, I think it's pretty clear that in trade, and particularly in productive systems, our economy is more integrated than the economy has ever been before. This is partly because trade liberalization has in fact gone further than ever before across the world as a whole. In the late 19th, early 20th century, Britain practiced free trade, but it was the only major country to do so, while tariffs are close to zero in many developed countries today. They're really very, very low. But in addition, modern communications has facilitated the integration of production process across frontier in a way that was quite inconceivable 100 years ago. But as I note, the integration of labour markets and labour migration is definitively smaller today, and it continues to be, despite the pressures for migration, much smaller than it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, probably 3 or 4 times smaller if you take the proportion of the population of the world that is now living in countries different from those in which it was born. And if you take, as Danny Roderick points out, as an indication of labour market distortions or segmentation, the differences in wages across the world, sort of 70 to 1 or so in real terms, it's pretty clear that the labour market is spectacularly segmented. But interestingly, the same seems to be true of capital markets. I give a whole host of statistics, and I can go to this, which suggests that in terms of net capital flows from rich countries to poor countries, in fact, in terms of capital market integration, the sort of famous Feldstein-Horioka sort of puzzle, the self-sufficiency of economies and capital and so forth, we have probably a less integrated world than we did in the late 19th and early 20th century. And we certainly have one which is less good at transferring capital from richer countries to poor countries, as I'm sure you all know, because I think it is the single most important fact about today's world economy. But incomparably, the largest recipient of capital in the world is the country in which you're living. And the developing countries as a whole are in aggregate, very strikingly, net capital exporters. So this, I think, supports the proposition that in some rather important respects, the world economy doesn't work as well as you would have thought as it did 100 years ago. I think there are a whole host of reasons for that, which I'm happy to discuss, partly to do with the monetary regime, the move from the gold standard to floating, partly to do with the uncertainty of property rights in many developing countries. But in essence, we have only a very partial reintegration. Then I'm going to discuss my fourth big theme, which is really taking out one chapter, but I think it's in many ways the most interesting for economists of this book, on looking at some of what has happened in this globalization era, the last 25 years, on growth and distribution across the world, poverty and so forth. And I think there's no great secret about this. In essence, the era of globalization, which sometimes people call, globalization equals Americanization. I think a more interesting way of thinking about it is that globalization equals Asianization. In essence, what is happening in this period, partly because of the globalization process, but more profoundly because of, narrowly defined, I think, but more profoundly because a number of Asian countries, above all the giants, have begun to sort out their own domestic policy systems in a sensible direction, has been a staggering reversal, simply staggering reversal of a fairly long-standing historical pattern that began in the early 19th century and really continued to the middle of the 20th, which was basically you had this huge economic revolution in the world, and Asia, which contains well over half of humanity and has historically clearly been the most advanced region in terms of economic activity, stagnated completely. And that started to change in the 50s and 60s, with Japan above all, and then what's the Chinese sometimes I think call the four little dragons, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore. But of course, in the last 25 years, China and India have joined this party, and now we are talking about half of humanity, and that is the big story of what's happened. And this story is shown, I think, somewhat in this chart, just to sort of give you some indication of some of what's been going on in the last 200 years and what may have been going on in the last 10, 20 years. This is from a paper by Bourguignon and Morrison. It's quite a well-known paper in which they did something, I have to admit, very heroic, but still very exciting, which is to try and make estimates, like all these economic history things, brave estimates, of what's happened to the global inequality among households, if you aggregate the whole world into sets of households, over the last 200 odd years. And the method they've chosen, they use the mean logarithmic deviation, and everybody here knows what that means, probably more than I do. And essentially the advantage of this particular measure is that it allows you to decompose the growing inequality in the world, or the changes in inequality among households, into two causes, because they're additive. One is inequality between country groups, which is the sort of bright purple line, and the other is, which is the inequality between the means of the distribution in each country, the average for each country, and the other is the inequality within country groups, which is the darker purple line, and then green is the total. And what you see, and I think it's the most important point to understand about the world economy and also about how globalization might affect inequality in this way is that from the period of 1820 till about 1880 or so on their figures, 1980 or so on their figures, there was a huge increase in inter-household inequality, and that was driven entirely by differences in average incomes among countries, or to more precisely, in the differences of rates of growth of countries. What happened therefore in the 19th and first two-thirds of the 20th century was that countries, some countries did very well, grew consistently, particularly Europe, America, Japan, and others didn't. And the result was this growing inequality among countries. Over this period, in fact, there was a sharp decline in inequality within countries, or modest decline in the early 20th century, which has since been reversed modestly, particularly in the last 20 years. What their data suggests, and I suggest, and I will show you one other source, it seems to me consistent with the other evidence, is that in the last 20 years or so, this has gone into reverse. And it's gone into reverse for a very, very simple and obvious reason, which is that China, and again to a lesser extent India, which contain 40% of the world's population or very close to it, have started growing consistently faster in terms of GDP per head than the world mean. And because they've been doing that, their relative income on average has risen, and that has dragged up their households with it, and therefore in the global sense has started to reverse inequality. So this just reinforces something that I've always believed, that the most important single determinant of global inequality is and remains the relative growth of nations. And here I take a chart from Saleh Martin, who's using exactly the same measure but much more detailed data sources. It's exactly the same measure, and it shows global inequality in exactly the same way from 1970 to the late 1980s, and you see a quite marked decline, which seems to support the hypothesis that there was the reversal. Interestingly, you will see the reversal reversed itself in the early 90s. That's quite important because there was a World Bank analyst who argued that what happened in the early 90s showed that in fact the world's inequality was getting worse. And the reason for that is quite interesting. It's basically Tiananmen Square. The collapsing Chinese growth following that reversed the whole pattern. China, in other words, has been dominating this picture to an extraordinary degree. Now I'll look very briefly at what's been happening to the extreme poverty as measured. And there's a huge controversy about whether it's a sensible measure, and I'm not going to go into all that because I simply don't have the time. I'm taking too long anyway. That if you take the standard World Bank's measure of poverty, which is $1 a day at PPP in 1985 prices, they wobble about the year, but this is a 1985 prices. And again, using essentially the same data as Bourguignon and Morrison, this shows the very long run pattern for both absolute numbers and proportions of the world population who were, as it were, desperately poor on the margin of subsistence. And the interesting thing about these data, I think, show two things, or perhaps three things. First, that the proportion of the world's population in this situation has declined progressively since industrialization began, from close to 90% down to 20%. And that is essentially what industrialization has achieved. It has removed us from living in a world in which almost everybody is on the margin of destitution and starvation to one in which a relatively small proportion of the population is. And that has been continuing progressively, and it continued rapidly in the age of globalization, as you can see. Secondly, the absolute numbers rose until probably 1980 or so when they started to fall, and they rose because, in essence, the growth of the world's population has offset the proportionate decline. Over the period since 1820, the world's population has increased sixfold, and of course the world's population in the last 40, 50 years has tended to rise fastest in the poorest countries. It's made it more difficult to achieve a decline. But anyway, this is what's happened to global poverty. And if you look at the last 20 years, and here there are three different measures. I'm using measures computed by three different sources, the World Bank, Surjit Bala and Saleh Martin. They all come out with the conclusion that the absolute number of people, not just the proportion, in absolute poverty, extreme destitution, has fallen in the last period of globalization. This is the 1990s. Again, consistent with what seems to have happened to growth. And this is the very latest World Bank data, which are, I think, quite stunning. At least they're from a consistent source, and the figures of what's happened in Asia are absolutely staggering. They take the same criteria, except that it's actually 92 prices. I don't know what that means. I'm sorry that disappeared from the chart. But essentially they show that in 1981, the number of people in this situation, East Asia and Pacific, was 767 million, and by 2001 it had fallen to 284 million. In China it went down from 606 to 212. There was a much slower decline in South Asia, but a big decline in the proportion of the population, and everywhere else did badly. Essentially, the era of globalization has been the era of the Asian miracle, or at least the Asian transformation. And if you look at the proportions of people in populations in extreme poverty, what has happened in the East Asia and Pacific region, which, may I remind you, contains more than 30% of the entire population of the world, so 7 times as much as the US, the proportions that have changed there is the largest proportionate reduction in poverty in any significant region of the world in a short period than there has ever been. And the World Bank is notorious for being very conservative in its estimates of these. Some think this is because the World Bank, there's a famous joke that the World Bank has a motto. If you've ever been to the World Bank, it says, "Our dream is a world without poverty." And some of us say, and in fact I've got it in the book, their nightmare is a world without poverty. So given that, these are very positive numbers, and these are much more positive in terms of what they think happened in the 80s and 90s than anything that they showed before. These are quite remarkable changes, and they show, in fact, that what has happened in East Asia and even South Asia, the decline. Many people, by the way, experts, Tien will comment on this perhaps, many experts think that the World Bank's numbers on South Asia are complete nonsense and much too pessimistic, but even there they show a very, very big proportionate decline. And what is driving all this, these are data I've taken from Angus Maddison, as I said, is essentially that this period of 73 to 98 has been the period when Asia, rapidly outgrowing Asia with a very high trade integration, very rapid growth of trade, has had an absolutely stunning performance over the whole period. GDP per head in Asia, excluding Japan, grew at 3.5% a year on average. This is almost three times as fast as the world average. China, of course, is considerably faster than that. There is no other place in the world that has done as well. And since Asia was desperately poor to start off with, this is why this process has been equalizing. What has all this got to do with trade? Just to conclude this section, well, I've just taken some data from the World Bank study of globalization, growth and poverty. I don't want to discuss how far trade liberalization per se has been the cause. It seems to me that's simply part of the movement towards the market. But one thing is clearly true, there's no question about it, that the countries that did best, they hear about 3 billion people living in these globalizing countries, are countries which had exceptionally rapid liberalization of trade and, above all, exceptionally rapid growth of trade. So the one conclusion at least one can reach, I think, with some confidence, is that integration into trade, into the world, globalization, has been consistent with exceptionally rapid trade performance, growth performance, and exceptionally rapid reductions in poverty, as I have indicates you. So that is, I think, the good side of the big picture. There are many, many other points in the book, but that will do enough. That will at least raise some questions, I hope, and lays out some facts about what has happened in what is generally a very positive period. I won't be able to go through what went wrong in Africa and Latin America, but I think it will be clear from what I've said earlier that I think a lot of it is to do with the way the state systems have continued to operate against the interests of the economy in those regions. Now, the final thing I want to do, and I apologize for having gone on a bit, is to ask the question, well, will it all last? Or are we again at the end of a period of rapid integration? If you read what people wrote in about 1900, it's pretty clear that nobody imagined that the catastrophe that was about to befall them would in fact befall them, and that the whole integrating system was going to fall to pieces in a relatively short period. I argue in the book that there were essentially 4 forces coming together that undermined and destroyed the liberal system at that time. Global geostrategic insecurity and conflict, first and foremost, the wars. Second, macroeconomic instability, above all, the breakdown of the world monetary system of the Great Depression. Then the way protectionist interests worked, the room for protectionist log rolling, particularly in the US, which was then matched by other countries. And finally, essentially in the very broadest sense, dirigist ideas. And I'll go very briefly through what I think about the plausibility of these as threats today. First, on insecurity, as we know, the first part of the 20th century was the era of the world wars. There were huge conflicts among the great powers. They tore to pieces the European economic system, and Europe was then the dominant part of the world economy. Now today, of course, we have fear of terrorism, and that clearly is potentially a real obstacle to commerce. It's certainly an obstacle to movement of people, and it's potentially an obstacle to the movement of goods if people are concerned that bombs, nuclear and other devices might be put into containers, for example. But at least for the moment, the good side of where we are is the great powers are at least roughly on the same side, and nobody really believes that territorial control, I'll come to this in a moment, is the way towards maintaining power. Risks ahead, well, I just like to mention three. The rise of China. We are witnessing one of the great transformations in relative power in world history. China is going to be, in my view, a superpower, and we know what happened with the rise of Germany and Japan, threatening the stability of the world system. There's obviously a risk, as I said, of mega-terrorism acts which really force countries to close borders, and I'm going to come in a moment to the possibility of resource wars. I'm modestly optimistic, but there are some real dangers here. I think one of the most interesting specific questions, since I mentioned resource wars, is the oil industry, since it's the most important single resource, oil and gas, in the world. And what is now absolutely clear for the first time, that Asian industrialization is hugely outstripping US growth, indeed the growth of anywhere else in the world, in terms of its incremental effects on world demand. China is now a much bigger factor at the margin in world markets for oil than the United States. If we look here, for example, at the incremental demand for oil in terms of millions of barrels a day between 2000 to 2004, you see that China's growth, that is the incremental increase, growth in demand is significantly greater than that of the North America as a whole, and all of Asia accounted for half of this. So Asia is now the dominant factor in world markets, and there's no doubt, in my view, that that's why the real oil price, which is the lighter purple figure, has got to what are now very high prices. They are as high now as they have been at any period in the last 30 years, except at the time of the second oil shock. So these are now very high oil prices. And the interesting question, obviously, is if this continues on up, is there a point at which, and you can answer this, the US will say to itself, well, we want cheap oil, we have the armies that protect all these oil regions, and we want this oil for ourselves. Never mind this nonsense about allowing the Chinese to have it at the same price as we do have it. And if the US made this possibly quite reasonable and realistic view of its right to extract oil, extract the rent for itself, there will be some quite interesting conflicts to come. The second one is instability, macro instability. The biggest single catastrophe undoubtedly was the Great Depression. That led directly to Hitler. We all know that. Now here, the interesting thing to me, and since we've had a lot of articles about it in the paper recently, is we know about financial crises in emerging market economies. That's not a big issue. But what are the risks ahead in the position of the US current account, its cumulative net liability position, and its asset price vulnerability? My assumption is that we're all going to get through this very smoothly because the world is a wonderfully comfortable and cozy place. But it does seem to me that there are huge adjustments ahead, and it'll be quite interesting to see how badly we mishandle them, because we usually do. Interests. Here I think there's really been a very important positive change, at least for those of us who want to keep the world economy open. Really, production was dominated by national companies with the same interests as their workforce. There was no international system to protect, to keep trade policy liberal like the WTO. Multinational companies changed the calculus of interest groups in protection very radically. And in particular, they create a big conflicts with the interests of their national workforces. And I think that has serious, very, very considerably diffused protectionist pressures, not only in developed countries, but essentially everywhere. However, we look ahead, there's clearly going to be middle-class anxiety. We can already read of this in the United States. as services are becoming much more internationally tradable than ever before. So there's another risk. And finally, ideas. In the early 20th century, we had belief in socialism and planning and import substitution. Today, of course, we've got the collapse of socialism, the move towards the market. But we do have a very significant group of anti-globalization protesters and a very powerful environmental movement which basically would like to stop growth as much as possible. So again, the question is, are we going to lose faith in the market and propose going back to much more restrictive dirigiste policies, which would, again, I tend to think, also affect openness to trade. What I would just like to close on these thoughts. I hope I've at least raised some issues. I'm sorry I went on for rather longer than I'd hoped. What's my conclusion? I think on the whole, despite all the problems, and I discuss the problems in the book, this is a process that has been largely benign. It has facilitated, at least, this staggering Asian transformation, which is the region which contains most of the world's poor and, above all, most of the world's people. It is, nonetheless, we know very well, a politically fragile project. It has collapsed before. It seems to me conceivable that it could collapse again. And I end the book with the hope that we will build on what we have achieved, spread the opportunities more widely, and not throw the whole effort of the post-war period to reconstruct a liberal international system away. Thank you very much.
Okay, Martin has accepted to take a few questions. Let's start over there.
I wonder if you might take a moment to talk about how the aging of populations in industrial countries might affect globalization trends in the next 20 years.
This is a question to which I've devoted a lot of columns. All available on the FT on subscription, of course. But I don't discuss it in the book, probably because I'm not convinced at the moment, or at least I wasn't convinced when I wrote the book, that it's central. The possible ramifications are, I suppose, I might have missed something, but I can think of three. Migration. A number of European countries, Japan and a number of other Asian countries are either on the verge of or already soon going to experience absolute population declines. And they are already experiencing, much of Southern Europe and Japan, absolute labour force declines. And of course, very considerable increases now in the overall dependency ratio, because the old age dependency ratio is rising faster than the child dependency ratio is falling. In this situation, you would expect countries to be interested in inward migration as a partial solution, particularly for the consumption of non-tradables. For tradables, you don't need it. This is creating, as I'm sure you know, very severe political tension in a quite large number of countries. The Japanese have in effect decided, as far as possible, not to have any. The Italians moan about it like anything. But anyway, the politics of migration is one huge issue potentially associated with the aging process. The second potential issue is what you might call the politics or geopolitics of capital flows. I mean, one rational, there's been lots of literature on the proposition that if you're going through this process, the sensible thing to do while you're in the high savings process, if you've got this situation, the sensible thing to do when you're in the stage when you've still got high savings and not such a high dependency ratio, is to invest a lot of money abroad where people have lots of cheap labour, and then you hope that you can live off the capital in your old age, as it were. This is not in fact what's happened. It's clearly not what's happened, nor is it what is happening, unless you regard the European and Asian investment in the United States as falling under that heading, and I don't think it does actually, but that's another matter. And it's not happening because, in essence, the significant I mean, on the scale that would actually make a real difference to total income, because I think the developing world as a whole, and China is probably the most important exception, but even then it's partial, has not persuaded the developed countries that their savings are safe in their markets. The developed country savers have the belief that if they invest all this money in these countries and then ask for it back to sell the capital, or at least the income, 20, 30 years from now, they're going to be expropriated. I think that's the only way you can see what's going on in these markets. But that's potentially a very, very important avenue, the capital flow mechanism. So I think capital and labour migration are both do relate to globalisation. The other aspects of ageing, which are going to have quite important effects on our societies, no doubt about it, don't seem to me to have directly to do with globalisation. And the most important, undoubtedly, is that a number of developed countries are, on the basis of their present commitments to their workforces in future, to their population in future, bust. So they will have to resolve this problem. I mean, I know there are some quite large figures for the contingent liabilities, the present value of the contingent liabilities of Social Security and Medicare in the United States, but they are dwarfed, I assure you, by the relevant figures for Germany or France. And there is going to be a long-running fiscal crisis, which it will be interesting to see resolved when, as I pointed out in one column of mine, well over half the electorate is over 50.
You talked about the importance of states within the context of globalization and growth. You look at China, and I wouldn't say it has an independent judiciary. The rule of law is not necessarily up to snuff to some other countries. So are we just, everyone's there because they need to be there, but they're really fighting around the edges? I mean, how do you think the political economy will relate to the politics there, and will the politics have an ramification on the economy?
Interesting question. And what's going on? I was just thinking about this at lunch in a way. I think that the one possible way of seeing the differences is that, so I don't discuss this as much in the book, I'm really sort of sad about this, but it seems to me plausible, and there's lots of reasons to believe this, that the quality of institutions, as it were, in these respects has to evolve with the level of welfare, in the level of output, productivity and efficiency in the economy as a whole. And I think the thing you have to remember about China, even compared with Latin America, is it's still a very, very poor country. So the opportunities they were exploiting in the last 25 years were, I think, really quite simple ones. They didn't require, the most important ones, as they related to globalization, and indeed as they related to development, were the exploitation of cheap labour in relatively labour-intensive activities which operated, particularly in critical sectors, almost as an enclave. It's very striking that half of China's exports are generated by plants which are run by FTI. Now, the Chinese have succeeded in persuading foreign investors that whatever's going on in China as a whole, these enclaves will be treated as if, as it were, they were property rights. They're not going to seize it all, and that they will be given a supportive treatment in terms of the long-term stability of these investments. So they seem to me to have created a credible quasi-property rights regime for these investors. My own guess is that as China develops and becomes more sophisticated, the economy has to develop, become more sophisticated, they will have to move quite a long way from where they are to sustain growth at anything like the present levels. And I think the same applies, though in some ways it has an easier position to get there, to a place like India. If you're at a middle income level, and don't forget Brazil is a good deal richer and so forth, then going further on involves quite a really substantially more sophisticated activities. Unless you're moving in those directions, it seems to me that the quality of the institutions and so forth matter more and more. One of the interesting indications of this point are that even countries which have done very, very well and obviously much better institutions like South Korea have begun to run up against quite significant limits in maintaining their growth momentum, even though in terms of GDP per head at PPP, South Korea is by OECD standards a pretty poor country. So the transformation that is required towards the more sophisticated institutions of advanced economies are really quite deep. But that is, anyway, is my view of what happened in China. They exploited, through liberalization, through the creation of essentially an enclave economy for FDI, a series of very favorable opportunities which their incredible supply of hard-working, very, very cheap labour allowed them to exploit. And I think that if they don't continue to reform, and I think it's not just what I think, it's what the Chinese government thinks, this growth process will run down. That is my perception. If that turns out not to be the case, and China becomes the richest country in the world on a GDP per head basis with their present institutions, then not only will I have to burn my book, but I think we'll have to burn most of economics and a large part of the literature on institutions, and I will bet it won't happen.
Yeah, you say that labor market integration has declined since the 19th century because migration is down, but I thought in a deeper sense, integration is much higher because of English having arrived as the world language and because of the internet. And migration is sometimes down because multinationals isn't necessary to migrate.
There are two arguments here. One is that argument, that is to say, the movement of capital and trade as substitutes, which theory would suggest. But there's a counter-argument against that, which is, in fact, the Roderick argument. I hate to say it, the argument is, in essence, if the market were integrated, we wouldn't get 71 to 1 ratio. That's probably exaggerating. But if you look at the data on the difference in the real wages, PPP and all the rest of it, of people doing essentially similar tasks with similar skills in developing countries today, you'll find the ratio is very, very much greater than it would have been 100 years ago. This is not surprising because GDP per head have diverged over that period, and average wages tend to go more or less in line with GDP per head. But if you had a fully integrated labour market, those differences would of course be arbitraged away through movement. It suggests, one, that trade and capital flows have not been an adequate offset, or even begun to be an adequate offset for the failure of labour market integration. And it also suggests that labour market integration is at the least very limited. Whether it is more limited than it was 100 years ago, I think is an open question. But I think that will be the argument. If you take price discrepancies, the implicit tariff, as it were, or between labour in different countries, say between India and the United States, doing essentially the same thing, driving buses, you would have to conclude this market is comparison with a theoretical world in which there were no obstacles to movement of people, fantastically fragmented. Tien, I suppose I should allow you to shoot me.
I want to get back to your China response. It seemed to me that China thus far has succeeded to manage globalization in economic sense, but where it could manage the political change is the question. It seems to me already, as we know very well, there are huge millions of people floating around with no particular, given the registration system that they have, who are a potential threat to the continuation of this managed globalization that they have succeeded. Now, you pointed out earlier there's a clear link between participatory democracy and the market-oriented economy, and which obviously is lacking in China. And I'm not seeing any direction or sign by way of China moving in the direction of participatory democracy. Now, where would you put your money if you were to bet whether China 20 years from now will be a more participatory society or not?
My bet would be that 120 years from now it will be a more participatory society and it will not be what you or I would consider a democracy. I said 20 years. In 120 years, I don't forecast that long. But of course it's the only forecast that's safe. So in 120 years from now it'll be a complete democracy. and you can dig my bones up and throw stones at them as Bernard Shaw once said. Gus, sorry.
This is connected to Ian's question. Also about China. Assuming there is some kind of liberalization, and I think you indicate there's a relationship between political change and economic change.
Yes,
Liberalization. And some symbiosis. You mentioned that you think of China as a threat because it might be a superpower.
No, I don't say I think it is a threat. I think it is conceivable that some people in this country might consider it a threat.
I thought you had among your threats. Anyway.
Oh, no, threat to global stability, yes,
Yeah,
because of the reaction.
My question really is whether we're better off, both politically and economically, with one superpower or two superpowers.
Until 3 years ago, until 2 years ago, my answer to that was always very simple. It was clearly better to have one. That wasn't the question, Gus. Dear. But I don't think we have the choice. So if we are moving towards a world with more than one superpower, then we have to manage that world. The reason I called it a threat to stability was that it seems to me pretty obvious that a world with two superpowers is less stable than a world with one superpower, and there is therefore some possibility of, at least seems to be plausible, there's some possibility of serious conflict between them. Now, as I said, that was how I believed the world was 2 or 3 years ago. Now I'm not so sure, in fact, that a world with one superpower is stable. For reasons that must by now be completely obvious. So I'm going to happen to say merely, what I'm going to say is merely that rivalries among great powers whose relative power are changing have had a pattern in history, as John Mearsheimer would point out, of always leading to war. And the Cold War was just a miracle. It didn't end in a hot war, but it was effectively a war. And that's going to happen again. So this is going to be, the realist argument will be that the conflicts are inevitable. The only issue is whether we can contain them without blowing the system apart. And if that's the case, then the rise of China is going to create, the move to duopoly is going to create some real problems. If it were a stable duopoly, that's another matter, but this is not a stable duopoly because one element in the duopoly is going to be rising in power relative to the other element, and that makes preemptive action attractive. Let's be brutal about it. Can I take the gentleman right at the back?
When you do the sums for the United States based on the period of globalization, you feel that globalization has been better for the United States on balance or worse?
Compared to what? Not globalizing. This is an interesting question because I don't know what the reference point would be. The performance of the US economy in aggregate over the last 25 years has gone in two quite puzzling stages. As I'm sure you know, between 73 and the mid-1990s, productivity growth in this country was surprisingly low. Surprising in the sense I don't think economists ever adequately explained why that happened. And aggregate job market performance was exceptional, we know that. But there's a lot of controversy about what happened to distribution of income in that period. In the 95 period to today, productivity growth has been extraordinarily high and apparently accelerating. You had a big cycle. We all know that, late 90s to today. But I suppose to most outsiders, including most outsiders in Europe, the aggregate economic performance of the United States in this period would be regarded as pretty successful and improving over time. Therefore, the economic problems, I would have thought, would be deemed as relating more to internal distribution, if that's a matter of concern to Americans, that's an American problem, as it were, and possibly some people would raise issues about long-run fiscal sustainability of the present situation. But I think most people would, analysts would view the United States as having had a pretty successful economic record overall in the last 25 years, if you look at it, and I think that will be my answer. Not stellar, but pretty good. Would it have done better if it had been significantly more closed? It's actually very interesting to think about what the counterfactual policies would have been. I presume they would have been designed to protect textiles, clothing, television assembly, the whole assembly process in electronics. I think it would have been a waste of time. But that's what it would have involved. I can't see why that would have improved the overall economic performance, and I would have thought it would tend to have worsened it a bit. Gentleman in the middle.
Yes, on the eve of the presidential election, I'm curious to know if you or the Financial Times would have endorsed one candidate or the other.
We have already done so we have already done so.
And my second question is what do you think the next president of the United States should do to reduce poverty in the world?
Oh my God. Now, the first question is simple. I was not involved in this discussion, and maybe we shouldn't have done this. We had a long discussion about whether we should or not, but for the last two elections we had endorsed someone, and we endorsed Senator Kerry. This is merely to show that we're not the Wall Street Journal, I think. I don't think this one was, I have to say, from a point of view of a foreign newspaper which sells more than a third of its copies in the United States, in this case it was not hard to do. I think it's very, very difficult to exaggerate. You know, I would consider myself a wildly, sort of mildly right-of-centre person who's traditionally been rather in favour of Republican presidents. There's no great secret, because I've written a column about it, that my admiration for the present president is limited. Now, even though he went to Yale, but I'm told that but his opponent did too. His opponent did too, so that's not an adequate reason for distinction. What should he do? You should do to lower world poverty? Well, I think that on the principle that we start off by not doing any harm, that making sure that the American economy grows and is open to the world, that the most egregious protection is eliminated. You know the famous stories about cotton and other agricultural things. I think those are the really important things. I would love to believe, and I'm writing about this for on Wednesday, that we did have some trick on how to solve the state-come development problems in those regions of the world where things are working so desperately badly, above all in Africa, parts of the Middle East, and parts of the Middle East, perhaps a little bit of Latin America. But I don't have, and I work long enough in development to know that I don't know what the answer is. But I do know what the problem is, and the more you read about it, think about it, the more deeper it seems to be. Stop the war on drugs, which I think is balmy, and that's about it. But I can discuss that at greater length, but those are, I think, the things you can do.
You made a comment at the beginning about the key role of declining telecommunications costs. We've now had a $1 trillion crash in the telecom sector's capital market, and together with technology, this is reducing costs even further. So I wonder what your trend line about this factor is, and what impact you think it will have on globalization, particularly in developing countries.
Well, investors have been very generous. Progress is paved with the stones of bankruptcy, and in this case, you're right. There's obviously an enormous investment went into infrastructure. The return is presumably very low, but it will be a permanent benefit, I assume. But more important than this is, and it's very visible if you go around the developing world, that the new communications technologies, not including cell telephony, mobile telephony, are really revolutionizing communications in the developing world. And in places like China, it's staggering. I think China now has the largest number of cell phone users in the world in absolute terms. I think it's about 400 or 500 million. I probably 400 million a month ago it's now. And India, it's also exploding. When I first went to India in the 70s, it took about 8 or 9 hours to get a line out of the country back to Washington, so we didn't try. Now India is part of the world. That's why it has an IT sector, and you're worried about offshoring. So I regard the development in telecommunications as facilitating not only the internationalization of the IT industry and the service sector which goes with it, and that's a whole range of issues, financial insurance and so forth. It's also what makes possible the integration of production across the world, and that's how you can operate factories essentially by the integration of components and parts shipped all over the world. It'd be completely impossible without it. And quite apart from that, I think communications, it has allowed individuals to communicate with one another across the world. And coming back to Tien's question, I do think it's going to prove seriously hard for the Chinese government, for all its efforts, to retain the sort of monopoly over information that it used to enjoy and is still trying to enjoy. And if it doesn't have a monopoly over information, its ability to control opinion is going to be limited. So I regard the revolution of, if you like, the information and technology and telecommunications revolution as the biggest economic event of our time, apart from the rise of China, and but not really just economics. It's a very, very profound social transformation. And I think, by and large, apart from the junk, as it were, that you see on television, so by and large, apart from the junk, a damn good thing. This gentleman.
I was continuing on that. I was wondering if you could speak for a minute about intellectual property rights and how they relate to globalization. Especially, we see essentially other countries now which are developing, and it seems like the very concept of intellectual property rights doesn't necessarily hold when you have unequal time frames, or when you have different time frames of developments in different countries. So how do you see the need to balance the need to maintain intellectual property restrictions with perhaps the needs of those countries to be able to use these kind of products?
Let me just first of all, I'm not an expert on intellectual property. In fact, of course, like all journalists, I'm not an expert on anything. But this is a hugely complicated and important field. I've written a bit about it, but I think there are two separate questions. First, forget altogether about globalization. There is a huge debate going on, as I'm sure you know, within this country particularly, though not exclusively this country, about the appropriate design of intellectual property regimes and the way they work within, as it were, a theoretical and practical context, just within the US, okay? And many people believe, one, that the present intellectual property regimes, particularly as they relate to copyright, are extremely defective and above all much too restrictive. And secondly, they're restrictive in a very particular way in trying to maintain not innovation, which is really what you're interested in, but the rental streams of very specific companies. It's the law for Disney, right? So a lot of people, Lawrence Lessig is obviously a classic example of an author in this field who writers I happen to know, would argue that these property right regimes are hugely defective, in accepting the obvious point that there is always in any property right regime a trade-off between the cost of the monopoly you're granting and the benefit in terms of the encouragement to innovation. And I think as far as copyright is concerned, I think the case is overwhelming. It's just ludicrously over-restrictive. In the case of patents law, there's also a lot of questions about the working of patent laws. And I don't want to go through all this, but I think it's extremely important to understand that property right regimes are extremely controversial, even within developed countries. They're obviously much more controversial when you take that given regime and start translating internationally, because it's a rent extraction device. And in essence, it's a way of transferring very large incomes from poor countries, which are not users of the intellectual property, to the rich owners of the intellectual property, when in fact there's absolutely not the slightest reason to suppose for a moment that the willingness of the owners of the intellectual property to innovate will be seriously affected by their rent extraction. This has made many of us feel that the introduction of the intellectual property right regime into the WTO, GATT then W, was wrong, and tricks and that the controversies it created were reasonable, and that it's a great pity. I happen to be one of those people. So I am very worried about them, and I haven't gone into all the other things like gene patenting and some of the trivial and absurd patents that have been granted. These are all very famous cases. I've just gone through the fact that there are real worries about the way property rights regimes are working anyway, and the worries are multiplied when you start applying them to developing countries. If I were, and indeed I discuss this in my book, not I think enough, I don't think it's not a subject discussed enough, it is the area in which the attack on corporate greed is most justified, in my view.
Yes, I wondered if I could come back to the question about the performance of the U.S. economy. We're running a current account deficit of something on the order of $600 billion a year, 4 or 5% of GDP. It's being financed by a very large amount of capital coming in from the rest of the world, especially Asia. Is this sustainable over the long run?
No.
And if not, how should we and our partners in the world be dealing with this?
It's not sustainable. I think it is caused more by what's going on in the rest of the world than the US. I've argued this often. It's a controversial position, but I think the tail is wagging the dog here. How will it change? Well, at some point, perfectly normal adjustments will occur, but they could, of course, be very swift and sudden, the way markets are. The real exchange rate will depreciate. It would have done so already if it had not been for this enormous intervention by foreign governments, which purchased about $1 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserve in 2001 and 2002. As the dollar falls, the trade adjustment will begin. As that happens, it will be necessary to adjust monetary and fiscal policy in this country to release the resources that will be going into the external balance. And that's, as you pointed out, a very big chunk of resources, so the adjustments will be large. The savings rates in the US and otherwise will have to rise, either public or private. Presumably it will be a mixture of both. The great credit binge will come to an end. That will have some interesting effects. I would imagine bond rates in the country will probably be a bit higher, and all the inverse will have to happen in the rest of the world. Because the resources the transfers involved are very large, I mean, it's actually quite interesting. I mean, the US is importing now something like a sixth of the gross savings of the rest of the world. We are talking really serious capital flows. The adjustments involved will be very large. My own view has been, this may be, that if you extrapolate this process, and it has gone on a linear trend to an extraordinary degree for the last 10 years, the numbers involved become so large 10 years from now, the adjustments then will be really extraordinarily big. And you can't imagine such adjustments occurring without really quite a lot of trauma. So I have tended to hope that it could happen sooner rather than later. I think it was very unfortunate that the US sat quietly by while these huge interventions were made. I think they should have taken the view that this was not helpful. But the simple answer is I take the Herbside view of this. What can't last won't. And any even plausible extrapolation of what's going on, I can go through the whole mechanics of demand supply and how this will fit, gives you a current account deficit of something in the neighbourhood of 8 or 9 to 10% of GDP within 4 or 5 years, and a net liability position of the US at about somewhere between 80 and 100% of GDP, which is a larger net liability position than any developed country has had since the war. I simply cannot believe that's going to happen, even in this current world. But of course, you could take the view, and there is a reason why I think Dick Cooper's argument, which is in our paper this morning, is completely wrong, is it is very important to remember that he's arguing the other side of this. It is very important to remember that the assets that foreigners are holding in the US are not in any way, are not assets which will in any way benefit from US superior growth, because they're nearly all bonds, and they are completely unhedged against depreciation and interest rate changes. In other words, to put it bluntly, they're on a hiding to nothing. And at some point, it seems to me, they will realise this fact. Europeans have already realised that fact. There's no net flow from Europe, and the only Asians who haven't realised that fact yet are the central bank. And though the Asians are impressively mercantilists, it does seem to me there must be a limit to the extent to which they're prepared to give resources to the United States in the confident knowledge they'll only get half of it back.
Last question. Last question.
Gentleman up there? Yes.
In your book, you say that one of the major threats to globalization is from the opponents to this. Could you say why you think there's a high risk their arguments will gain traction, given that they're a small minority and given that their interests would appear to be out of whack with the interests of the rest of society in developed countries?
Bad ideas, I think they are bad ideas for the most part, gain traction when people are frightened and miserable. At the moment, some sensationally bad ideas have gained traction in the United States because people are frightened and miserable, but they're bad ideas from the right. I merely suggest, my own view would be, if things went seriously wrong, and I don't discuss that adequately in the book, what I would imagine is a time in which the economy works really badly, perhaps because of the scale of the adjustments that we've just talked about and the bankruptcies that will be associated with that. Imagine a process like that, and a convergence of the left and the right view that the solution to this problem is greater self-sufficiency and less reliance on the world. The terrorist threats could multiply that. I've already discussed some of the threats that would come through trade, and so I would imagine a confluence of very bad economic performance, very real concern about terrorism associated with trade, as I said, the nuclear device that goes off in a container in a major port, and the convergence of the left and right view that what we need to do is to go towards a more self-sufficient, more protected economy. I get oodles of emails from people now arguing that the offshoring phenomenon is really the ultimate destruction of the American dream, and that therefore trade must be stopped. I tend to the view now that the protest movement would be a relatively small element in that, and it is actually going far more likely to be driven, as historically it's been driven in the United States, protectionism from the right than from the left. And I think in that respect, my focus on the protest movement in this context was misguided. One of the reasons why I wanted to make the focus, however, is it seems to me, and I feel in retrospect that I didn't make that clear enough in the book, though I've actually got the sentences, I can quote the sentences, that the protest movement contains a lot of people who ought to believe in some of the benefits of all this, and that they should see it seems to be a reasonable position for them to take would have been something like, we could do much better than we have. There are clearly real problems with this market-driven globalization stuff, but we also have to recognize some good things that come out of this, the sort that I mentioned. Because there seemed to be a point at which essentially the left was turning against trade completely, and because that was happening, at the same time the right is always open to nationalist, economic nationalist arguments, that I was concerned that what you'd have is essentially a convergence between the two. And that still seems to me the most plausible scenario for Pat Buchanan and Ralph Nader do agree on some things, and this is what they agree on.
What about Joe Stiglitz?
I have no idea where Joe fits into this. Again, this is psychologizing. It's not economics. That's something else. But it seems to me that if I look at Europe too, it's the same problem. I mean, if you look at France, which is certainly the most protectionist nation in Europe, what is striking is that the extreme right and the extreme left basically think exactly the same things, and that, to my mind, would be the danger. I think it would only become serious if the economy started performing really, really badly, as it did in the interwar period, above all, of course, in the 30s. As I say in the opening to my book, it was Keynes' great view that economics is not really particularly important, and human beings have far better things to do with their lives than worry about it. But if things go wrong, they sure go wrong.
With that, thank you.